From the center of the universe, Toronto, Ontario, Canada, this is the SDM Show with your host, Rob Cairns. The SDM Show focuses on business, life, productivity, digital marketing, WordPress, and more. Sit back, relax, grab your favorite drink, and enjoy the show. Here is Rob.
Hey everybody, I'm Rob Cairns. I'm the founder, CEO, and chief creator of Amazing Ideas at Stunning Digital Marketing. In this podcast, I sit down with Amber Hines and we talk accessibility and what it means for your website. Grab a drink, sit back, relax, and enjoy the conversation. This episode of the SDM Show is sponsored by Stunning Digital Marketing, the agency to handle all your WordPress website security needs. Go on over to stunningdigitalmarketing.com and find out how we can help you secure your website so you no longer have an issue with backups, being hacked, or your website being compromised. That's stunningdigitalmarketing.com. Hey everybody, Rob Cairns here. Today my guest on the SDM Show is Amber Hines. How are you today, Amber?
I'm doing well, Rob. Thanks for having me.
Oh, such a pleasure. Before we jump into what I really want to talk about, and that's accessibility, I always like to ask, what's your WordPress origin story? How did you get into WordPress, and how did that come about?
Yeah, so I got into it as a blogger initially. I mean, way back in the day, I had a Zanga blog. Do you remember those? Mm-hmm. And then when I was pregnant with my oldest daughter, we lived across the country from all of our family in New York by ourselves. And I was like, how can I tell people what's going on in our life? And so for about 5 minutes, I think I played around with, I don't know if it was like Weebly or Wix or like one of those first kind of drag and drop things. And I was like, oh, this doesn't work. So then I went to WordPress.com and I was on WordPress.com for about 9 months before I got tired of the limitations on how I could edit my theme and what themes I could choose, because it was the early days of WordPress.com. And so I went self-hosted pretty quickly from there, and it eventually became a business where I realized at one point in time that I could charge people when they asked me questions about how to make their website better and for helping them with their websites. And then it eventually grew to I have a team.
Yeah, it's amazing. Many of us got in by blogging back in the day, and you know, my story's pretty similar. I actually started, funny enough, with an HTML website because I got fed up with answering family tech questions. So I used to post responses online, actually, and then it morphed into a blog and turned into a business. And you know,
yeah. So you could just say, "Grandma, go read this post from 2 months ago," and you'll get the same answer I gave you last time.
Yeah, well, like yesterday and the week before and the week before and the week before, right? So. Yeah, that's funny. So you are what I consider an accessibility expert. How did you get working in accessibility? That's a really tough area niche to get into.
So I knew nothing about accessibility. And in 2016, my team got hired to work on a website for a department at Colorado State University. Mm-hmm. And it was a little bit, I jokingly call it trial by fire, because all university websites in the United States are required to be accessible to at least WCAG 2.0 AA standards. Mm-hmm. And the university was just getting into place around the time when we started doing work, a process for doing like formal accessibility reviews and audits before new websites could launch. So we got to go through that process as one of their first guinea pigs on that, as one of the first outside developers that they had worked with also. And so that really was when I first realized what it was. And of course, then it was a lot more kind of reactive accessibility. But over time, we realized, we liked working with the government and the higher ed clients and the larger businesses. And so accessibility just became part of our standard process. And at one point, I said, we really need to bring users in, especially on some of these government websites, because we're saying that they're accessible, but how do we really know beyond, what we've been learning and reading about and studying and the web content accessibility guidelines? And so we hired 2 students from Texas School for the Blind and Visually Impaired to test website and give us feedback. And that was just eye-opening for me. And that was in, it was towards the end of 2019, beginning of 2020. And it really, I think seeing people navigate websites on screen readers just really opened my eyes even more. And so that, for me, I was just like, okay, this is it. This is what I want to focus on. And this is how I feel like I can make a big impact on the world. And that's sort of what got us into accessibility.
Yeah, it's a big problem. I was sharing with you before we went to record. I did some work with a nonprofit for about 7 months. I actually ran all their email stuff out of ActiveCampaign and trying to make emails accessible. And they were, being a nonprofit, they fall into accessibility guidelines in Ontario, and they were in the process of bringing all their websites at the time up to accessibility to meet government criteria and legal reasons and things like that. And people don't realize it's more than just playing around with the tags or playing around with the colors. There's a whole big process to accessibility.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the thing that's interesting, and it's definitely a large learning curve, because it's not really just during your testing and debug phase, let's say, that you make things accessible. There's a lot of talk in the accessibility community of shifting left and trying to move accessibility as early into the process. So even when we're designing, we're doing accessibility audits of our designs before it's even being built out into code, or our content. I mean, we start training our clients on accessibility subversively during our discovery phase when they send us inspiration websites. We'll sometimes, be like, oh, this is nice, except for XYZ, to help them start to see accessibility problems, because I think they don't really see it. So it is definitely a process, but I think once you get into it and you build the routine, and some things, once you've built that in, you just know color contrast, or you just know our links can never just say learn more. Then you build that habit in, whether it's in content or design or whether it's in code. And then I think it goes a little bit faster.
Yeah. Now let's jump into colors since you mentioned it. Are there certain types of colors or color contrasts that work really well versus some that don't work well? I mean, there's discussion that lighter colors are better. Is that true? And where does that kind of fall?
So there is no inaccessible color. Any individual color can be used, and you don't have to be limited by accessibility guidelines in your color selection. What you are limited by is in your color combinations. There's 2 different levels of color contrast ratio. So there's actually a mathematical formula that calculates the difference in luminosity and shade between 2 different colors. And there's the AA, which for a lot of people is considered the standard. And then AAA has a higher contrast ratio where they're further apart. We try as much as possible on color contrast to sit in the AAA land, but sometimes we end up with AA just because there needs to be more options. But it's really about making sure that the background is sufficiently different from the foreground. And so, you can use orange, for example, on a button, but you need to put dark blue or black text on it, not white text, those sorts of things. So it's not that, some people say orange is an inaccessible color, and that's not the case. It's just you have to be thoughtful about how you use certain colors.
Yeah, I think that's the case too. And, along with color goes fonts. And I would think a little bigger font would be better. But that said, I think many web designers use fonts that are too small to start with, even for non-accessible reasons. like who puts out a website in a 12-point font anymore? Like it's just
Yeah. So I'd say I'm typically sighted. I mean, I wear glasses or contacts depending upon the day. I'm still in my 30s. I'm getting closer to that 40-point mark. But
I'm
like
there.
I sometimes encounter websites when I'm just like, I cannot read this. The text is too small. So I think, yeah, font size comes into play when it comes to fonts. And I've only, I've read about some studies that are really fascinating. If you really like do some research on like font accessibility, Carrie Fisher is someone who's done a lot of research on that. And she actually gave a talk for our WordPress accessibility meetup on it. But like, there's a lot you can get into with the kerning or the spacing between letters. Obviously, you don't want them to be too tight. It's also helpful if it's consistent. So in some fonts, the spacing between letters changes based upon what letter it is, or the width of letters is like drastically different in some situations. Also having, whether it's serif or sans serif, but one of the things that is really helpful is making sure that your letters are distinctive from one another. So for example, you don't want your B and D to be exact mirrors of one another, because that could be hard for someone with dyslexia whose mind might flip the letter as they're coming across it. You want them to have subtle differences, like maybe in the height of the tail that goes up, or I guess it's not a tail if it goes up, or whether maybe it has like a slight serif or the rounding is slightly different on the curve. Another really common one is making sure that your uppercase I, your lowercase l, and your number 1 look different from one another. They shouldn't all just be a straight line, because that can make it more challenging for people to read. So there's a whole bunch of like the art of fonts that I think is really cool if people are interested, that they could get into on what makes fonts easier for people to read.
Yeah, and as people get older, I mean, I've got a mom who's 77, and she's constantly saying to me, "This website is small," and I said, "Yeah, it's small, and I'm younger, and I'm forever doing the old Control Plus to increase the size of the website because somebody didn't take that into effect, and that's an interesting conversation there."
Yeah, and that's, I might add on that real quick. Something that is also really important with accessibility is that it's mobile responsive. Like a lot of people don't realize mobile responsive actually goes hand in hand with accessibility a lot, because if someone is increasing the size of the font, which for people with low vision, they may be increasing the website to 200% or more.
Yeah.
And they might always engage with the web in that way. And so you want to make sure that when that's done, that the text, you haven't added anything in the code that would stop the font from resizing, that it can just normally resize as someone zooms in on their browser. And also it has to reflow well. So, it needs to wrap and not go off screen or get cut off. And of course, your mobile menu then has to work on a desktop, because a lot of times when you zoom in 200%, you get the mobile menu instead of the desktop menu.
So true. That's a really good point. And then the other thing we like to think about, and I know I do a lot of newsletter stuff, I personally prefer to put buttons on stuff. If somebody's going to read more or link to an article, I personally don't like to just highlight the link and put the hyperlink in, because I think from an accessibility point of view, if somebody's got a vision problem, it's really harder to see than a button where they can just push. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So it is an interesting conversation, because I think what you're saying actually isn't that you put a button in, it's just that you put a link in and you style it to look like a button. Is that right? Rather than using an HTML button tag.
That's correct.
Yeah. So I do think that, so tap size can come into play, especially on mobile devices, and it can be really helpful when links are styled like buttons on that sense, because it can make the area that someone can tap on larger. there's also this whole conversation about, is this confusing for people because the functionality of a button is different than the functionality of a link. But I think at this point, it's so ubiquitous that we style links like buttons when we're making them more like a CTA or to like attract attention to them, that I feel like most people are sort of used to that at this point in time. But I do think, that can be helpful, whether it's to attract attention or to give people a larger area that they could click or tap on if they're on a mobile device, definitely.
Yeah. And then the other thing that people always forget about, and, we see it again and again when I look at sites, even from an SEO perspective, but it matters for accessibility, is image tags. And I can't tell you the number of websites I look at that people just refuse to put image tags into the website. And that is a big problem.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, having alternative text is really important for people who can't see, so they know what the image is about. Or if something is wrong and the image doesn't load, a sighted person would see that as well. And as you mentioned, it's super great for SEO. I feel like alt text is one of those like low hanging fruits that should be easy to do. And even in social media now, Twitter has done a great job, I feel like, of making it easy to add alt text, and they even flag. So it's almost like the hall of shame on tweets, because you can see who's putting in the effort to putting in alt text and who is just like not bothering,
and
because they have a visible label of alt on the image, and so everyone can see if it's there or not.
Yeah, and I'm awful, and I admit that. So there you go. That's actually a recent change, like in the last month, pretty well, I think. It's
making it visible. Yeah. I think it's important. And I think that's something like that sort of visibility, because some people might be like, well, what is this? I don't know what this is, right? If they aren't a web developer, they haven't heard of accessibility before, just the average user. And so the fact that they made it really visible that there is alt text and allow anyone to click on it and read that alt text, whether or not they're using a screen reader and they don't have to inspect the code, I think is really great for helping to bring awareness to the need for alt text and the need for people to be thoughtful in the content that they're putting out on the web and how it impacts people with disabilities.
Yeah, it's so true. It's funny, and I think we have to think about, as web hosts or designers, how we put content out. So like an example is, if you put out a podcast, do you put out a show notes that can be read? Do you put out content in different formats? Because what people don't realize is, first of all, we consume content differently, but when we get in accessibility, even more so. And, we're kind of focusing on, right now, we've been talking more about people who can't see or people can't hear, but there's a lot of other cognitive accessibility issues that are what I call hidden illnesses that we never see. And we got to factor those in too as well, and be aware that it's not just hearing and sight that are the issues here.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, a really big one that I think people don't maybe think about as much as the blind and deaf community is people with mobility challenges. So there are a lot of sighted people who can see that some of them use screen readers because they have neurodivergence. Some of them use screen readers because it's easier for them to hear the text than to, or to move through the page with the screen reader. Some people use keyboard, they just use a keyboard only, or they're using completely alternative devices. Like there's a keyboard called the Darcy USB keyboard, which is just a couple buttons, and it allows someone who has very limited mobility, like they can maybe only move one finger, to use Morse code to move around and engage with the web. So mobility is a big one. Epilepsy is another one, or people that have vestibular or inner ear disorders. So I've heard someone speak, and they were talking about how their wife was on a website and there was so much like motion moving in and parallax that she got so nauseous that she just like threw up. Right. Yeah. And those are things that a lot of us don't even realize. Our website, if it's coded in a certain way, could make someone feel physically ill, or it could cause them to have a seizure. And then there's the whole land of situational limitations, or things that, as you mentioned, like hidden disabilities. So like ADD, there are certain things on websites that can make it harder for someone with ADD, or dyslexia we talked about earlier. The situational limitation, a great example of that is if you're riding on the train and you don't have headphones and you come across a video, but you don't want to play it and bother everyone on the train, and it doesn't have captions, you're probably just going to skip that video. And that website owner is going to miss out, or, whoever put it out on social media is going to miss out on that potential person in their user base. And that's not it's a situational limitation, but it still comes into play with accessibility.
Yeah, so true. I really like that discussion highlighting, everything. Now, the problem with accessibility is many organizations only jump into it for legal reasons. In Canada, and certainly I think in the States, for a nonprofit, your websites must be accessible. For government, they must be accessible. And then other companies don't seem to jump into it, frankly, until they're sued or they lose a lawsuit, instead of kind of doing the right thing. And that's, if your reach is so big, maybe you should just bite the bullet and make it accessible to start with.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could say that you didn't have to motivate with the fear of a government fine or a lawsuit. But we definitely see that, like, statistically. There's a big deal made in Ontario at the beginning of the year because there was a lot, or maybe it was, now I'm spacing on it. It was actually last year, I think, when the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, AODA, had sort of a cliff where they started to require websites of organizations with more than, I think it's 25 employees, have to file an annual accessibility report.
They do.
And so It was interesting for us because we have an accessibility auditing tool that we saw a lot of purchases at that time of year from people in Ontario. Like, it's a huge shift in who was buying our product. Mm-hmm. And I wish I could say that a bunch of people were just like, let's do something great and test for accessibility problems on our website. But in reality, I think it was motivated by the legislation and the fear of getting a fine. But that said, like, I do think there are organizations out there that, maybe they have really strong diversity, equity, and inclusion goals. And so they're thinking more broadly about how people with disabilities can be included in everything that they do, whether it's their employees or their customers, and making their website accessible as part of that. So I do think that there are organizations that are approaching it from the more like positive, like, how can we make a difference in the world? I don't think it's all fear of lawsuit, but yeah, that is definitely a motivator for some people.
Yeah, there was no question. The deadline in Ontario last year was, I believe, was like June 15th or something, somewhere in June. So it didn't surprise me. And I can remember walking into meetings every day and listening to the web accessibility talk and just shaking my head saying, oh boy, like it's been
interesting. I was at Access U, which is an accessibility conference last week, and someone I know pretty well from the web who focuses on accessibility, Cam is his name. He was down and he's from Ontario. And I asked him, if he had really noticed a difference. And he was saying it's a really great law with no teeth. So he doesn't think that they're actually sending out notices or doing anything. But I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's just a matter of time for them to figure out what their process is for doing automated scans, sort of like the WebAIM Millium, and then just sending out form letters automatically to people.
What I will tell you, Amber, is Canada as a whole in the digital space when it comes to privacy, accessibility, and a lot of other things are really more stringent than a lot of places. So I think the time is coming. It's just the rude awakening will hit sooner or later, to be honest with you. So,
yeah. And, the privacy conversation is really interesting because one of the things you don't really think about, maybe, I think a lot of people are familiar with different privacy legislation around the world, like GDPR, for example. And here in the United States, there's some really strict regulations around privacy in California. Well, a lot of those cookie notices that pop up on websites are not keyboard accessible, or there's no focus shifted to them. A blind person can't really interact with them. So if you are asking someone to legally accept something or agree to your privacy policy or your cookie policy, but they actually can't because it's inaccessible, I've seen cases where the quote contract with someone with a disability was thrown out because they were able to show that they actually didn't accept it, or they had no way of fully reading it or anything like that. And so that's something I think that organizations that are aware of their privacy requirements really have to keep in mind, that accessibility and ensuring that all people can actually read your privacy documents is really important.
So true. So company A wants to make their WordPress website accessible, and they say, "I forget this. I'm just going to go buy an accessibility template," and we've all heard this story, and be done with it. I don't think that's going to solve their problem, but what are your thoughts on that?
So in WordPress, there are themes that have been audited by people that know a little bit about accessibility on the themes team, and they follow some basic standards for best practices in accessibility. And they have the accessibility ready tag in the WordPress theme repository. Okay. These are a great starting point, but they will not ensure that your website is accessible. And the main reason for that is the moment you add a plugin from a plugin developer who's never tested for accessibility, or the moment you start, inserting custom widgets from other vendors around the web, then you're likely to be adding accessibility problems. Another thing as well is that a lot of problems come in the form of the content. So users are adding them right in the content editor. Like we talked about earlier, they're inserting an image and they're not filling in that alt text box when they really should be.
That's so true. And good advice.
Yeah, so it's not just about the theme. The theme can be a good starting point, but that alone will not get you an accessible website.
Is there an easy way to audit a website to see if it's accessible or not?
So there are some automated tools. I mentioned earlier, we have one, it's called Accessibility Checker. It works specifically in WordPress. So it's a WordPress plugin. There's a free version on .org, and then we have a pro version, and it puts reports. So a really great parallel is if you think about some of your favorite SEO plugins and how on your poster page edit screen, it gives you a little summary of what you've done right or wrong with your SEO. Our plugin does similar for accessibility. There's also some browser extensions that are free that are really useful for doing front end scans on websites. A really popular one is called Wave. IBM also has one that's completely open source called Enable Access. And those are just browser plugins that you can install in your browser and test websites with. So those are probably the best way to get started with automated testing. What's important to know is that automated tools, including ours, can't catch 100% of the issues. There are just some things that require a human being to assess it. So for example, we can tell you if you're missing alternative text, but we can't necessarily tell you if your alternative text is correct in the use of the image on the page, if that makes sense. So a human would have to assess that. Yeah. Or keyboard focus. So for people who kind of want to start diving into it, another great thing in addition to automated tests is going just to the front end of your website and using your tab key, maybe your arrow keys and your return key, and seeing if you can do everything on your website that someone would do with a mouse. So can you get to every page? Can you submit forms? Can you add products to the cart and check out? All of those things with your tab key only. And that would start to give you a feel for what the keyboard user experience is like.
Yeah, that's some really good advice. Amber, thanks for having a conversation about accessibility. I think it's really important and people need to be aware of it. I mean, accessibility is taking more of a forefront. And I think it's just kind of accepting what people are capable of doing and not capable of doing, personally.
Yeah. So you're just sort of wondering, like, how to know where your limits are.
Yeah, basically. Yeah.
So I think, I think there are different schools of thought on this. I tend to be in the camp that, don't let perfection get in the way of progress. So even if someone, maybe they don't have a budget to hire an accessibility consultant, they're building their own website themselves, like they don't even have an external developer, using some of the automated testing tools and doing that keyboard testing, like I mentioned. And if you really get interested in it, you could try using a screen reader. There are free screen readers. If you're on a Mac, it has VoiceOver. If you're on Windows, you can get an open source free screen reader called NVDA. So just doing some testing yourself will make a difference, and you'll be able to use the tools and find problems. Now, whether or not you'll always know how to fix them, if you're not a developer, you may be able to, if it's a content problem, if it's something that a plugin inserted that is a developer, requires a dev fix or a code fix, then you're in the land of either reaching out to that plugin developer, or you might have to find another developer to write a patch for you. So there is sometimes more of a limit to what people can do on their own on the fixing or the remediation side. And then I think if you are a developer or an agency, you have to maybe be a little bit more careful if you're telling your clients that you can deliver an accessible website to them, but you don't actually know what that means, or you're not super experienced in it. Especially, I would say, here in the States, because I have seen cases where the website developer got pulled into the lawsuit. Yeah. And if you, in your statement of work, had said you would deliver an accessible website, and then the client gets sued because there's accessibility problems left over on the website, then you could be putting yourself at risk. So I think, for individuals, get started. And, if you can't pull in a consultant, don't pull in a consultant. Just do the best you can. But if you're approaching it from a business standpoint, then I would be a lot more cautious about just saying, I'm not going to, I'm going to do everything on my own, and I'm not going to pull in a consultant or another company to help with these aspects of it. At least for the first few, it's very helpful to have someone show you how to test, have someone point out the problems to you. And once you have them audit enough of your websites, you're going to start to see the pattern of what those problems are or how they're finding those problems, and you'll be able to do it more on your own.
Yeah, it's so true. If somebody wants to get a hold of you or your team to talk about accessibility, how's the best way?
So our website is equalizedigital.com. And you can get a hold of us there. We also have a Facebook group, WordPress Accessibility, on Facebook. And I'm on Twitter at Hey Amber Hines.
And I would say that's probably the best place to get Amber. She seems to be there more than she would care to admit, right?
Yes, I'm pretty active on Twitter these days.
Yeah. Thanks, Amber. Have an amazing day, and thanks for the conversation.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Bye-bye. This episode of the SDM Show is sponsored by Stunning Digital Marketing, the agency to handle all your WordPress website security needs. Go on over to stunningdigitalmarketing.com and find out how we can help you secure your website so you no longer have an issue with backups, being hacked, or your website being compromised. That's stunningdigitalmarketing.com. A very special thank you to Amber for joining me on this edition of the SDM Show. Thank you for listening to this edition of the SDM Show. The SDM Show is brought to you by Rob Cairns and Stunning Digital Marketing. For more information about Rob Cairns and Stunning Digital Marketing, go to stunningdigitalmarketing.info. From here, you can connect to us on social media, go to our website, and even go to the podcast to subscribe. This podcast is dedicated to my late father, Bruce Cairns. Dad, I miss you very much. Keep your feet on the ground. Keep reaching for the stars. Make your business succeed.